Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My first week at Hartley Insurance started on a Monday in early October 2018, right when the leaves in Portland were turning that deep amber color that makes the whole city look like a photograph. After spending nearly a decade bouncing between temp jobs and retail positions since graduating high school in 2008, landing a permanent role with actual benefits felt like finally catching my breath. The office was one of those renovated buildings downtown, exposed brick walls and too much fluorescent lighting. But I remember walking in and thinking this was my chance to build something stable. My cubicle was on the third floor, wedged between a filing cabinet and a window that overlooked the parking garage. Human Resources paired me with a senior claims processor named Boyd Whitmore for my training period, which they said would last about 3 weeks. He had been with the company for 11 years, and everyone spoke about him like he was some kind of institution. When we shook hands that first morning, he held on just a beat longer than normal, looked me dead in the eyes, and said he was going to take really good care of me. Boyd was somewhere in his mid-40s, with thinning gray hair that he combed straight back, and these pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink at a normal rate. He wore the same rotation of 3 polo shirts throughout the week, always tucked into khakis that were ironed with military precision. During those initial days, he was thorough and patient, explaining the claims software step by step, never making me feel stupid for asking questions. But even then, there were small things that made me pause. He would stand behind my chair while I worked, close enough that I could smell his coffee breath on my neck, narrating everything I typed. When I mentioned grabbing lunch from the break room, he insisted on joining me every single time, positioning himself between me and the door. By the end of that first week, he knew my full name, my address from some onboarding paperwork he claimed to have glimpsed, and the fact that I lived alone in an apartment complex off Hawthorne Street. I told myself he was just being friendly, that this was what mentorship looked like in a corporate environment. I had no idea how wrong I was. The second week is when things started to shift. Boyd began sharing personal details about his life that felt wildly inappropriate for a professional setting, let alone someone I had known for only 7 days. He told me about his divorce, which had happened 4 years prior, and how his ex-wife had taken everything from him, including his dignity. He described the empty apartment he went home to every night, the silence that greeted him when he unlocked the door, the way he sometimes forgot to eat dinner because there was no one there to remind him. These conversations always happened when we were alone, usually in the small conference room where he conducted my training sessions with the door closed. He would pause mid-explanation about a claims procedure, stare at some fixed point on the wall, and then launch into another confession about his loneliness. I tried to be sympathetic at first, offering the kind of vague, supportive statements you give to acquaintances going through a hard time. But then he grabbed my hand across the table one afternoon, squeezed it tight, and told me I was the only person who truly understood him. I pulled my hand back and made some excuse about needing to use the restroom. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, my face had gone pale, and there was this tight knot forming in my chest that would become a permanent fixture over the following weeks. After that incident, I started noticing how Boyd had positioned himself as a barrier between me and the rest of the office. Whenever someone stopped by my cubicle to introduce themselves, he would materialize within seconds, steering the conversation back to work or finding some reason to pull me away. A woman named Heather from accounting tried to invite me to a Friday happy hour during my 3rd week, and Boyd intercepted before I could even respond, telling her that I was still in training and needed to focus. He said it with this polite smile plastered on his face, but his tone left no room for argument. Heather gave me this look, eyebrows slightly raised like she was trying to communicate something without words. I wish I had paid more attention to that look. I wish I had followed her to her desk and asked what she knew about Boyd Whitmore that I clearly did not. By the end of October, my training period was officially over, but Boyd acted like nothing had changed. He still showed up at my cubicle first thing every morning with a cup of coffee made exactly the way I liked it, still insisted on eating lunch together, still found reasons to hover near my desk throughout the day. When I tried to politely decline his company, explaining that I needed to focus on my own workload now, his entire demeanor shifted. His face went blank for a moment, completely expressionless, and then he said something that still echoes in my head to this day. He called me his closest person, not his closest friend, not his work buddy, but his closest person, like I was somehow essential to his existence. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was stating an obvious truth that I should have already known. I told him that was a really intense thing to say to a coworker, that we barely knew each other, and that I needed some professional distance. He just nodded slowly, that blank expression returning, and walked away without another word. I thought maybe I had finally gotten through to him. The next morning, I overheard Boyd talking to one of the senior managers near the coffee machine. I was walking past, and he did not seem to notice me, or maybe he did, and wanted me to hear. He was saying that he was worried about me, that I had been struggling emotionally since starting at the company, that I had confided in him about personal problems at home. He lowered his voice to this concerned whisper, and said he was the only support system I had right now. The manager, a man named Glenn who I had maybe spoken to twice, was nodding along sympathetically. I stood there frozen in the hallway, unable to process what I was hearing. Boyd was constructing an entire fictional narrative about me, painting himself as my caretaker, and me as some fragile mess who needed him. When I finally gathered myself enough to approach Glenn later that day, planning to set the record straight, he looked at me with this pitying expression and asked if everything was okay at home. Boyd had gotten to him first. Boyd had gotten to everyone first. I started keeping a written log of every interaction, every lie I overheard him tell, every time he showed up uninvited at my desk. My notebook filled up fast. November came with gray skies and early darkness, and I began dreading the walk to my car at the end of each shift. The parking garage was attached to the building, 4 levels of concrete and dim lighting, and the kind of echoing silence that amplifies every footstep. I always parked on the 3rd level because it was closest to the elevator, but now that familiar route felt different. One evening, about a week after I had set boundaries with Boyd, I walked out to my car and noticed him standing 3 rows away, leaning against a concrete pillar with his arms crossed. He was just standing there watching me, not approaching, not waving, just staring with those unblinking pale eyes. I fumbled with my keys, got into my Subaru as fast as I could, and locked the doors immediately. When I looked in my rearview mirror as I pulled out of the space, he was still there, still watching, still completely motionless. I told myself it was a coincidence, that maybe he had parked nearby and was just heading to his own car. But he did not move. He just stood there until I turned the corner and lost sight of him. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. Boyd would always be somewhere in the garage when I left, never in the same spot twice, but always positioned so that he had a clear view of my car. Sometimes he would be sitting on the hood of his own vehicle, a faded green sedan that looked like it had not been washed in years. Other times he would be standing near the stairwell exit, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted like he was studying me. He never said anything, never approached, never acknowledged that what he was doing was deeply disturbing. It was always just that silent presence, that unwavering stare. I started varying my departure times, leaving 15 minutes early or staying an hour late, but somehow he always knew. No matter when I walked out to that garage, Boyd Whitmore would be there waiting. I mentioned it to Heather one morning, pulling her aside in the break room where Boyd could not see us. She went quiet for a moment, then told me something that made my whole body go cold. She said there had been another woman before me, a claims processor who started about 2 years ago and quit after only 4 months. Heather said nobody talked about it, but the woman had filed a complaint with HR before she left. Nothing ever came of it. Boyd was too valuable, too senior, too protected. I filed my own complaint with HR the following Monday, bringing my notebook full of documentation, and trying to keep my voice steady as I explained everything to a woman named Diane, who sat behind a desk covered in motivational posters. She listened, nodded in all the right places, took notes on a yellow legal pad, and assured me the company took these matters very seriously. She said they would investigate and get back to me within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks passed without a single word. When I finally followed up, Diane told me that after reviewing the situation, they had determined Boyd's behavior did not constitute harassment under company policy. She said he was simply being friendly and that perhaps I had misinterpreted his intentions. I asked about the parking garage incidents, about him waiting for me every single night, and she actually smiled and said that employees were allowed to use the parking facilities at any time. There was nothing they could do. I walked out of that office feeling like the walls were closing in, like I was trapped in some nightmare where the rules did not apply to the person hurting me. That night, when I saw Boyd standing at the garage exit with his arms folded across his chest, he lifted one hand and gave me a slow wave. He knew I had reported him, and he knew nothing would happen. The day everything changed started like any other Thursday in mid-November. I got to work early, hoping to avoid Boyd in the morning, but he was already at my cubicle when I stepped off the elevator. He had brought me coffee again, that same cup with 2 sugars, and he was sitting in my chair like he belonged there. When he saw me, he stood up and held out the cup with both hands like an offering. I told him I did not want it, that I needed him to leave my workspace immediately, that I was documenting everything for a potential legal case. Something flickered behind his eyes when I said that, something quick and dark that disappeared as fast as it came. He set the coffee down on my desk very slowly, very deliberately, and then he leaned in close enough that I could see the individual pores on his face. He whispered that I was making a mistake, that he was the only one who truly cared about me, that everyone else in this office was just pretending. He said I would regret pushing him away. Then he straightened up, smoothed down his polo shirt, and walked back to his own desk like nothing had happened. My legs felt weak. I had to sit down in my chair, the same chair he had just been sitting in, and I could still feel the warmth from his body on the fabric. That evening, I did not go to the parking garage alone. I had called my older brother Nathan during my lunch break, voice cracking as I explained what had been happening for the past 6 weeks. He drove an hour from Salem to meet me at the office, and when 5 o'clock came, we walked to the garage together. Nathan is a big guy, former college linebacker, the kind of person whose presence alone makes you feel safer. Boyd was there, of course, standing near the elevator doors on the 3rd level with that same blank expression. But when he saw Nathan walking beside me, something shifted. His face twitched, just slightly, like a glitch in a mask he had been wearing. Nathan stared him down the entire walk to my car, not saying a word, just making it absolutely clear that I was not alone anymore. Boyd did not wave that night. He did not move at all. He just watched us drive away, and in my rearview mirror, I saw him take out his phone and start typing something. I did not sleep well that night, wondering what message he was composing, who he was telling lies to now. The next morning, I walked into the office and went straight to Glenn, the senior manager, before Boyd could intercept me. I told him everything in a calm, measured voice, including the threat from the day before and the fact that Boyd had been waiting in the garage every single night. I told him about the previous woman who had quit, about the HR complaint that went nowhere, about how this pattern was going to keep repeating unless someone actually did something. Glenn looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, avoiding eye contact. He said he would talk to Boyd, that maybe there had been some misunderstandings. I told him that was not good enough, that I had already consulted with a lawyer and was prepared to take legal action against both Boyd and the company if this continued. That got his attention. His whole posture changed, and he asked me to give him 24 hours. The next day, I received an email from HR informing me that Boyd Whitmore had been placed on administrative leave, pending a formal investigation. 2 weeks later, he was terminated. I never saw him in the parking garage again. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that Boyd disappeared from my life completely after his termination. For about 3 months, things were quiet. I started making friends at the office, finally went to those Friday happy hours with Heather, and slowly felt the tension drain from my shoulders every time I walked to my car without seeing anyone waiting in the shadows. But then, in February, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of me walking into my apartment building, taken from across the street. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "I still think about you." I called the police that same day and filed for a restraining order. The judge granted it after I presented my documentation, my notebook full of dates and incidents, the photograph, and a statement from Heather about the previous employee. Boyd violated the order once, showing up at a grocery store where I was shopping, standing at the end of the aisle just watching me. He was arrested, spent 3 days in jail, and after that, I never saw him again. I moved to a different part of the city 6 months later, got a new job at a smaller company, where I actually felt valued, and tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. It has been almost 7 years now, and sometimes I still check my rear-view mirror when I leave work. Sometimes I still feel a chill when a coworker stands too close or offers to bring me coffee. The thing that sticks with me most is not the fear, though that was real enough. It is the way everyone around me dismissed what was happening until I threatened to make it their problem. Boyd Whitmore spent 11 years at that company doing this to women, and nothing changed until lawyers got involved. I think about that other woman sometimes, the one who quit before me, and I wonder if she is okay, if she moved on, if she still looks over her shoulder in parking garages. I tell this story now because I want people to understand that predators do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like helpful coworkers with coffee and encouraging sticky notes. Sometimes they wear khakis and polo shirts and speak so softly, you have to lean in close to hear them. Trust your instincts, document everything, and do not let anyone make you feel crazy for protecting yourself. Overnight shifts at a gas station in the middle of nowhere have a way of making you question your life choices. My graduating class from 2011 had scattered across the country chasing careers and dreams, while I found myself behind a counter in rural Ohio, selling cigarettes and energy drinks to truckers passing through on Route 42. It was early February, a Wednesday night so cold that the air itself seemed frozen, and the fluorescent lights above the pumps flickered every few minutes like they were trying to send a message. I worked at a place called Rusty's Quick Stop, though nobody named Rusty had owned it in decades. Now it belonged to some corporation out of Chicago that sent us paychecks and nothing else. My shift partner that night was a guy named Boyd Pittman, a wiry man in his early 40s with deep-set eyes and a patchy beard that never quite filled in right. Boyd had been working there longer than anyone could remember, and he had this habit of humming old country songs under his breath while he restocked the coolers. We got along fine, mostly because neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. The trouble started around 11:30, when a customer pulled up in a beat-up Chevy pickup with rust eating through the wheel wells. He was a heavy-set guy in a camo jacket, the kind of regular we saw every week buying the same pack of Marlboro Reds and a tall boy of Bud Light. I was in the back doing inventory when I heard voices rising at the front counter. Not shouting exactly, but that tense, clipped tone people use right before things go sideways. By the time I came through the storage room door, the customer was already leaving, slamming the glass door hard enough to rattle the whole frame. Boyd stood behind the register with his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. When I asked what happened, he just shook his head and said the guy had accused him of shortchanging him by $1.50. It seemed like such a small thing at the time, the kind of minor friction that evaporates the moment the customer drives away. But Boyd kept staring at that door long after the taillights disappeared into the darkness, and something in his expression had shifted in a way I could not quite name. For the next hour, Boyd seemed to retreat into himself. He wandered between the aisles, straightening products that did not need straightening, adjusting candy bars so their labels faced forward with an almost obsessive precision. I tried to make small talk a few times, asked if he wanted me to grab him a coffee from the machine, mentioned that the weather was supposed to warm up by the weekend, but he barely acknowledged me. He just kept muttering under his breath, too quiet for me to catch the words, but loud enough that I could hear the rhythm of it, like he was rehearsing something or counting. Around 12:15, a couple stopped in to use the restroom and grab some snacks for the road, and Boyd refused to ring them up. He just stood there behind the counter staring at a spot on the wall while I apologized and handled the transaction myself. The woman gave me a look that said, "What's wrong with him?" And I shrugged like it was no big deal, even though my pulse had started to pick up in a way I did not like. After the couple left, Boyd announced he was going to the storage room to check on something. I said okay, figuring maybe he just needed a few minutes alone to shake off whatever was eating at him. The storage room was through a heavy metal door at the back of the building, a cluttered space filled with boxes of merchandise, cleaning supplies, and broken equipment that nobody had bothered to throw away. I went back to my spot behind the register and pulled out my phone, scrolling through nothing in particular just to pass the time. That was when I heard the first crash, a heavy, violent sound like shelving collapsing under weight. I called out Boyd's name, but there was no answer. Then came another crash, followed by a third, and beneath it all I could hear something that made the hair on my arms stand up straight. Boyd was laughing. Not a normal laugh, not the kind you let out when something is funny. This was high-pitched and breathless, almost like sobbing, and it did not stop. It just kept going and going while things shattered and tumbled in that back room. My first instinct was to call our manager, a guy named Lou Hensley, who lived about 20 minutes away in the nearest actual town. Lou was not exactly the kind of boss who inspired loyalty. He spent most of his time at home watching cable and only showed up to collect the register totals. But he was the only authority figure I had access to at that moment. I moved toward the landline phone mounted on the wall behind the counter, the one we used for calling in orders and emergencies. When I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone, just dead silence. I pressed the hook switch a few times, thinking maybe the connection was loose, but nothing happened. That was strange because that phone had worked fine earlier in the evening when Lou had called to check if we needed anything from the supplier. I followed the cord with my eyes, tracing it along the wall toward the back office, where it connected to the main junction box. The cord disappeared through a gap in the wall paneling, and when I crouched down to look closer, I saw that it had been pulled clean out. Not cut, but yanked with enough force to rip the wires from their housing. The plastic casing was cracked, and the copper wiring inside hung limp like exposed tendons. A cold realization crept through me as I stood back up. Boyd had gone to the storage room maybe 10 minutes ago, but the back office shared a wall with that space. He could have easily slipped through the connecting door and torn out the phone line without me noticing. The crashing and laughing would have covered any sound. I reached for my cell phone in my back pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen showed no signal. That was not unusual for this stretch of road. Cell coverage out here was spotty on a good day and nearly non-existent at night when atmospheric conditions shifted. Still, seeing those empty bars made my chest tighten in a way that bordered on panic. I was alone in this fluorescent-lit box in the middle of frozen farmland, miles from the nearest house, and the only other person here had just destroyed the only reliable way to call for help. The laughter from the storage room had stopped now, replaced by a silence that felt almost worse. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator units along the back wall, the tick of the clock above the door, and beneath it all, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the concrete floor of the storage room toward the door that led back to the main floor. I thought about running. The front door was maybe 15 feet away, and my car was parked on the side of the building near the dumpsters. But my keys were in my jacket, and my jacket was hanging on a hook in the back office. The same back office that shared a door with the storage room where Boyd was. For a split second, I considered just bolting outside anyway, flagging down a passing car or walking until I found a signal. But the temperature out there was well below freezing, and the next town was at least 8 miles down the road. I would be a popsicle before anyone found me. So I stayed where I was, standing behind the counter with my heart hammering against my ribs, watching that storage room door like it was the mouth of something hungry. The footsteps stopped. Then the door swung open slowly, the hinges groaning in a way I had never noticed before, and Boyd stepped through. He looked different now, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. His shoulders were relaxed, his movements smooth and unhurried. The frantic energy from before had drained away completely, leaving behind something that resembled calm, but did not feel like it. His eyes found mine across the store, and he smiled. It was the kind of smile you see on someone who has just solved a problem that has been bothering them for years. Boyd walked toward the counter without saying a word. His right hand hung loosely at his side, but I noticed his left arm was positioned slightly behind his back, the elbow bent at an unnatural angle like he was concealing something. I tried to keep my voice steady when I spoke, asking him if everything was okay, if he wanted to talk about what just happened in the storage room. He did not answer right away. Instead, he stopped about 3 feet from the counter and tilted his head to the side, studying me the way a child might study an insect before deciding whether to crush it. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and measured, almost gentle. He said he had been thinking about things for a long time now, years actually, and that tonight something had finally clicked into place. He said he understood now what needed to be done, what he should have done a long time ago. I asked him what he meant, trying to keep the conversation going, trying to buy time for something I could not even name. Boyd brought his left hand around from behind his back, and I saw the box cutter gripped in his fingers. The blade was extended, catching the fluorescent light in a way that made it look almost surgical. He held it loosely, casually, like it was just another tool he used every day, which technically it was. We used those box cutters to open shipments, to slice through packing tape, to break down cardboard. But the way Boyd looked at it now made it clear he had something else in mind entirely. I kept the counter between us, my mind racing through every possible option. There was a baseball bat under the register. Lou had put it there years ago after a string of robberies hit gas stations along the highway, but reaching for it would mean taking my eyes off Boyd, and I was not willing to do that. Instead, I started talking. I told Boyd that whatever was going on, we could figure it out together. I reminded him that we had worked side by side for almost 2 years without any problems, that I considered him a decent guy, that I did not want to see him throw his life away over some customer who was not worth the trouble. Boyd listened with that same unsettling patience, the box cutter turning slowly between his fingers like a nervous habit. When I finished, he let out a long breath through his nose and shook his head like I had missed the point entirely. He said this was not about the customer. It was never about the customer. That man had just been the final piece of a puzzle Boyd had been assembling in his head for longer than he could remember. He talked about feeling invisible his whole life, about giving everything to jobs and people who never gave anything back, about waking up every morning knowing that nothing he did would ever matter to anyone. His voice stayed calm the whole time, almost philosophical, and that was what scared me more than anything. This was not rage. This was something that had been thought through, rationalized, accepted. Boyd took a step closer to the counter, and I instinctively stepped back until my shoulders hit the cigarette display behind me. He noticed the movement and stopped, tilting his head again with what looked almost like curiosity. He asked if I was afraid of him, and I did not see any point in lying. I told him yes, I was terrified. Something flickered across his face then, just for a moment, like my honesty had surprised him. He lowered the box cutter slightly, not putting it away but letting his arm relax at his side. He said he was not going to hurt me. That was not what tonight was about. He said there was someone else, someone who deserved what was coming, and once he took care of that, everything would finally balance out. I asked who he was talking about, and Boyd's expression hardened into something distant and cold. He mentioned a name I did not recognize. His ex-wife, he explained, who had taken his kids and moved to Indiana 3 years ago. He said she was the reason he had ended up in this dead-end job, the reason he had nothing left, The reason he woke up every day feeling like a ghost walking through a world that had already forgotten him. He was going to drive to her house tonight after our shift ended, and he was going to make sure she understood exactly how much pain she had caused him. The way he said it, so matter-of-fact and certain, made me realize that Boyd was not having a breakdown. He had already broken, probably a long time ago, and what I was seeing now was just the final crack spreading through the surface. I knew I had to do something. If Boyd walked out that door and drove to Indiana, someone was going to die. Maybe his ex-wife, maybe his kids if they got in the way, maybe Boyd himself when the police caught up with him. And I would have to live with knowing I stood there and let it happen. So I did the only thing I could think of in that moment. I lied. I told Boyd I understood how he felt, that I had been through something similar after my own father walked out on our family when I was a kid. I told him that hurting his ex-wife would not fix anything. It would just mean his children would grow up knowing their father was a murderer, and they would hate him for it the same way I hated my dad for abandoning us. None of it was true. My parents were still married, still living in the same house in Columbus where I grew up. But I watched Boyd's face as I spoke, searching for any crack in that terrifying composure, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. He was listening. Really listening. I kept going, making up details about sleepless nights and therapy sessions, and the long road to forgiving someone who had hurt me deeply. I told him that revenge was a door that only opened one way, and once you walked through it, you could never come back. Boyd stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a minute or two. The box cutter was still in his hand, but his grip had loosened, and the blade was no longer pointed in my direction. He looked exhausted suddenly, like all the energy that had been fueling him had drained away at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he was tired. So tired of being angry, of carrying all this weight, of waking up every day with nothing to look forward to except more of the same emptiness. I saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes, and for the first time that night, Boyd looked less like a threat and more like what he really was, a broken man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump. I asked him to put down the box cutter, and after a long pause, he set it on the counter between us. The metal clattered against the surface, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. I came around the counter slowly, keeping my movements calm and deliberate, and I picked up the box cutter and slid it into my back pocket. Boyd did not try to stop me. He just stood there with his arms hanging limp at his sides, staring at the floor like he had forgotten where he was. Around 1 a.m, a semi-truck pulled into the lot to refuel, and the driver came inside to pay. I used the opportunity to ask if I could borrow his phone, told him mine had died, and I needed to make an urgent call. He handed it over without asking questions, and I stepped outside into the freezing air and dialed 911. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. My coworker had experienced some kind of mental health crisis. He had made threats against his ex-wife, and I needed someone to come out here before he changed his mind and tried to leave. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, and that officers were being sent from the county sheriff's office about 25 minutes away. When I went back inside, Boyd was sitting on the floor behind the counter with his knees pulled up to his chest, rocking slightly and humming one of those old country songs he always hummed during his shifts. He did not look up when I approached. He did not seem to notice anything at all anymore. I sat down on the floor a few feet away from him and waited, watching the parking lot through the glass doors for the flash of red and blue lights. Neither of us said a word. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and somewhere outside, the wind howled across the frozen fields, and I remember thinking that this was the longest night of my entire life. The police arrived around 1:40, 2 cruisers pulling into the lot with their lights on but no sirens. They took Boyd away in handcuffs, though he did not resist. He just walked between the officers like a sleepwalker, his eyes empty and distant. One of the deputies stayed behind to take my statement, and I told him everything that had happened from the argument with the customer to the moment I called for help. He said I had probably saved at least 1 life that night, maybe more, and that I should be proud of how I handled things. I did not feel proud. I felt hollow and exhausted and deeply shaken in a way I had never experienced before. I quit working at Rusty's Quick Stop a week later, could not bring myself to go back to that building, to stand behind that counter, to look at the spot where Boyd had set down that box cutter. I heard later that he was admitted to a psychiatric facility downstate, that his ex-wife had been notified about the threats and had taken out a restraining order. I never saw Boyd again. Sometimes I still think about that night, about how close everything came to going wrong, about the lies I told to keep a broken man from destroying himself and everyone around him. I do not know if what I did was right. I just know that when the sun finally came up the next morning, everyone who was supposed to be alive was still breathing, and maybe that is the only thing that matters in the end. Everyone at Harmon's Home Goods thought I was lucky to land the assistant manager position right after finishing community college in 2015. My mom kept telling her friends how proud she was, how her daughter was climbing the ladder at 23, while other kids from my graduating class were still figuring out what to do with their lives. The store sat in a small strip mall outside of Dayton, Ohio, sandwiched between a nail salon and a Chinese takeout place that always smelled like burnt sesame oil. Nothing glamorous, but the pay was decent, and the hours gave me enough time to take online classes toward my business degree. The store itself was one of those places that sold everything from picture frames to artificial plants, the kind of shop where middle-aged women spent Sunday afternoons browsing for things they did not really need. My manager, a heavy-set guy named Dennis who had been there for 15 years, trusted me enough to let me handle closing shifts alone most weeknights. It was quiet work, mostly restocking shelves and running the register for the few customers who wandered in after dinner. I liked the solitude, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the predictable rhythm of it all. That changed when corporate hired a new stock associate in early March. His name was Leonard Voss, and from the very first day, something about him made the air feel heavier. He was maybe 40, thin in a way that made his clothes hang loose on his frame, with pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink at the right moments. Leonard was polite to an almost uncomfortable degree, the kind of person who would hold a door open for you and then stand there smiling until you were completely through, watching the whole time. He spoke softly, always measuring his words like each one cost him something precious. The other employees found him odd but harmless, joking that he was probably just awkward from spending too much time alone, but I noticed things they did not. He started showing up 30 minutes before his shifts, sitting in his car in the parking lot with the engine off, just staring at the storefront. After closing time, when everyone else rushed to leave, Leonard would linger in the stockroom, rearranging boxes that did not need rearranging. Dennis said he was just dedicated, that we should be grateful someone actually wanted to work. I wanted to believe that. I really did. The Wednesday that everything fell apart started like any other closing shift. Dennis left around 6, patting me on the shoulder and reminding me to double-check the back door before I locked up. The evening crowd was thin, just a few regulars and a couple arguing over which lampshade matched their couch better. Leonard clocked in at 4, but was already there when I arrived at 3:30. Leaning against the wall near the employee entrance with a cup of gas station coffee in his hand. He smiled when he saw me, that slow, careful smile that showed too many teeth, and said something about how the weather was getting warmer. I nodded and walked past him quickly, pretending I needed to check something on my phone. By 8, the store was empty, except for the two of us. I told Leonard he could head out early since we were dead, but he shook his head and said he wanted to help me organize the stockroom. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it that made my chest tighten. I should have insisted, should have made up some excuse about needing to do inventory alone. Instead, I just shrugged and said sure, thinking maybe I was being paranoid about a guy who was simply trying to be helpful. The stockroom at Harmon's was a narrow maze of metal shelving units stacked with boxes of merchandise waiting to be unpacked. The lighting back there was harsh and uneven, casting long shadows that shifted every time you moved between the aisles. Leonard followed me in and immediately started straightening boxes on the lower shelves, humming something tuneless under his breath. I was reaching for a box of ceramic vases on a high shelf when my elbow caught the strap of his backpack, which he had left sitting on top of a crate near the door. The bag tumbled to the concrete floor and spilled open, scattering its contents in a messy arc across the ground. Pens, a water bottle, some crumpled receipts, and then a manila folder that slid out and fanned open, revealing a stack of papers covered in official-looking print. I crouched down to help gather everything, already apologizing, when my eyes caught a photograph paper-clipped to one of the documents. It was a woman, maybe early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and a nervous smile. Below the photo, in bold capital letters, were the words, "Restraining Order," followed by a case number and a date from 2016. My hands went cold and I felt the air leave my lungs, but I kept my face neutral, shoving everything back into the folder without looking at it again. I handed Leonard his backpack and forced a laugh, saying something about how clumsy I was, how I was always knocking things over. He took the bag from me slowly, his fingers brushing against mine for just a second too long. When I looked up at his face, the polite mask he always wore had slipped, just slightly, like a picture frame hanging crooked on a wall. His pale eyes studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, searching my expression for something I was desperately trying to hide. He asked me if I saw anything interesting in there, his voice still soft but with a new edge to it, like a knife wrapped in velvet. I shook my head and told him I was not paying attention, that I just grabbed everything and stuffed it back in. For a moment, neither of us moved. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed and flickered, and I became painfully aware of how far we were from the front of the store, from the windows, from anyone who might walk by and see us. Then Leonard smiled again, but this time it did not reach his eyes. He said it was fine, that he appreciated me helping him pick everything up, and he zipped the backpack closed with slow, deliberate movements. After that, the atmosphere in the store shifted into something I cannot quite describe. It was like the air had thickened, like every shadow in my peripheral vision was watching me. Leonard did not go back to organizing the stockroom. Instead, he followed me out onto the sales floor and stayed within 15 feet of me no matter where I went. When I walked to the register to count the drawer, he appeared at the end of the aisle, pretending to straighten a display of picture frames. When I moved to the home decor section to fix a fallen sign, he was suddenly there too, examining a set of candles like they were the most fascinating things he had ever seen. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, that the store was small and we were bound to cross paths. But every time I turned around, there he was, those unblinking eyes locked onto me with a patience that felt predatory. Around 9:30, he finally spoke again. He was standing near the greeting card section, maybe 10 feet away from me, and he asked in that measured voice of his whether I thought people trusted too easily these days. I pretended not to hear him at first, hoping he would let it go. He did not. He repeated the question, slower this time, and added that some people just hand over their trust to strangers without ever stopping to wonder if they should. I mumbled something about how I guessed that was true, trying to keep my voice steady while my heart slammed against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Leonard nodded slowly, as if I had just confirmed something he already knew. He took a few steps closer, close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath and see a small scar on his chin I had never noticed before. He told me he used to work at a department store up in Michigan, a place called Burgers that went out of business a few years back. Said he had a coworker there, a young woman named Heather who was a lot like me. Friendly, hardworking, always willing to close alone because she thought it made her look dedicated. His voice dropped lower when he said her name, almost tender, and something about the way he lingered on those two syllables made my stomach turn. I asked him what happened to her, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Leonard tilted his head to one side, studying me the way a cat studies a mouse that has wandered too far from its hole. He said he was not sure, that she stopped showing up to work one day and nobody ever heard from her again. Then he smiled, that wrong smile that showed all his teeth, and said some people just vanish like that, like smoke. The next hour was the longest of my life. I kept glancing at the clock above the register, watching the minutes crawl by with agonizing slowness. Leonard stayed close, always close, commenting on things in that soft voice that now sounded like a threat wrapped in politeness. He asked me if anyone knew I was working tonight, if my family expected me home at a certain time. When I lied and said my boyfriend was picking me up at 10, something flickered across his face, a micro-expression of annoyance that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. He recovered fast, nodding and saying that was nice, that it was smart for a young woman to have someone looking out for her. I did not have a boyfriend. I lived alone in a studio apartment 15 minutes away, and the only person who might notice if I did not come home was my cat. But Leonard did not need to know that. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me and pulling out my phone with trembling fingers. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I even say? That my coworker was being creepy? That I found some papers in his bag? I needed more, something concrete that would make them take me seriously. So I opened my browser and typed in his name along with the word restraining order, praying that whatever I found would tell me I was overreacting. The search results loaded slowly on my cracked phone screen, each second stretching into an eternity, while I stood in that cramped bathroom with my back pressed against the cold tile wall. The first few links were useless, just social media profiles and a white pages listing. But then I found an article from a local news station in Grand Rapids, dated January 2017. The headline read, "Person of interest named in Burger's employee disappearance case." There was a photo of Leonard, younger but unmistakably him, standing outside a police station with his lawyer. The article said a 26-year-old woman named Heather Dominguez had been reported missing after failing to show up for her shift at Burger's department store. Coworkers told investigators that a male employee had been exhibiting unusual behavior toward her in the weeks before she vanished. Leonard Voss was questioned multiple times but never charged due to insufficient evidence. Heather's car was found abandoned in a parking garage 3 miles from the store. Her body was never recovered. I scrolled further and found another article mentioning that a restraining order had been filed against Leonard by a different woman, a neighbor who claimed he had been watching her apartment for months. The case was dropped when she moved out of state. My vision blurred, and I had to grip the edge of the sink to keep from collapsing. The man outside that door, the man who had been following me all night, was almost certainly responsible for making a woman disappear forever. I gave myself 60 seconds to fall apart, letting the panic wash over me in hot waves before forcing it back down. I could not afford to lose control, not now. Not with Leonard waiting somewhere out there on the sales floor. I flushed the toilet to keep up appearances and ran the sink for a few seconds, buying myself time to think. My phone showed 9:47, which meant I had maybe 13 minutes before closing time, before I would have to walk out to the dark parking lot where Leonard's car sat waiting like a patient predator. I thought about calling 911 right there, but the bathroom had no windows and only one door, and if Leonard heard me talking to the police, I had no idea what he might do. I needed to get to the front of the store, closer to the entrance, closer to the security cameras that fed into the monitor in Dennis's office. I needed to act normal for just a little longer. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out, my legs feeling like they were made of wet cement. Leonard was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching me emerge with an expression that was somehow both blank and hungry at the same time. He asked if I was feeling okay, said I had been in there a while. I told him my stomach was bothering me, something I ate for lunch. He nodded slowly, those pale eyes never leaving my face, and said we should probably start closing up soon. I walked toward the front of the store with Leonard trailing behind me, his footsteps soft and measured on the linoleum floor. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to bolt for the door and never look back. But I knew that would only trigger whatever violence he was capable of. Instead, I kept my pace steady and my breathing controlled, focusing on the glowing exit sign above the entrance like it was a lighthouse guiding me through a storm. When I reached the register, I made a show of counting the drawer while secretly typing a text to my older brother Kevin, with one hand hidden below the counter. I wrote 3 words, Call me now." 30 seconds later, my phone rang, the sound cutting through the silence like a Ju-Ming lifeline. I answered it loudly, saying Kevin's name and asking him where he was, pretending to listen while he asked me what was going on. I told him I was just finishing up at work and that I would meet him outside in 2 minutes, making sure my voice carried across the store. Leonard had stopped near the greeting card aisle, watching me with an unreadable expression. I saw his jaw tighten, saw his hands curl into loose fists at his sides, and for one terrifying moment I thought he was going to call my bluff. But then something shifted in his posture, a subtle relaxation that told me he had decided tonight was not the night. He grabbed his backpack from behind the counter and told me he was going to head out, that he would see me tomorrow. I watched him walk through the automatic doors and disappear into the darkness of the parking lot, and I did not take a full breath until I saw the headlights of his old Chevy pull out onto the main road. Kevin stayed on the phone with me while I locked up the store and sprinted to my car, my keys clutched between my fingers like a weapon. I drove straight to the police station and told them everything, showed them the articles on my phone, gave them Leonard's full name and the license plate number I had memorized weeks ago out of some instinct I could not explain at the time. The detective who took my statement was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with every detail I shared. She told me they would look into it, that they would contact the department in Michigan and see if there was enough to reopen the investigation. I never went back to Harmon's. I called Dennis the next morning and quit over the phone, not giving him a reason, not caring what he thought. A week later, Kevin helped me move to a different city, a fresh start somewhere Leonard Voss would never find me. I learned from a news article 6 months later that he had been arrested in Indiana after a woman reported him for following her home from her workplace. The police searched his apartment and found photographs of dozens of women, taken without their knowledge, along with journals filled with detailed observations about their routines. Heather Dominguez was never found, and I still think about her sometimes, wonder if things might have been different if someone had trusted their instincts sooner. I think about how close I came to becoming another name in one of his journals, another woman who vanished like smoke. And I think about how the only reason I am here to tell this story is because I listened to that small voice in the back of my head, the one that kept whispering that something was deeply, terribly wrong with the quiet man who smiled too much and never blinked at the right moments. Night shift at Holbrook Distribution Center paid better than anything else I could find after dropping out of college my sophomore year. My parents had graduated in the class of '89, both of them, and here I was stacking boxes in a warehouse outside of Portland while my younger sister finished her nursing degree. It was humbling, sure, but the work was steady and the people mostly kept to themselves. I had been there about 8 months when Curtis Beale transferred from the morning crew to our shift. He was one of those guys who stood a little too close when he talked, always finding reasons to hover near my station in the picking area. At first I thought he was just lonely, new to the shift, no friends yet, probably nervous. He had this habit of laughing at things that were not funny, this dry chuckle that came half a second too late. I made the mistake of being polite to him during my first week working alongside him, and I think he took that politeness as an invitation to something more. Curtis was probably somewhere in his mid-40s, with thinning hair he combed straight back, and these watery blue eyes that never seemed to blink enough. He wore the same rotation of 3 polo shirts under his safety vest, and he always smelled faintly of menthol cigarettes and cheap soap. The first few conversations were harmless enough. He asked about my car, about whether I liked the shift supervisor, about what kind of music I listened to during my commute. I answered with short sentences, nothing personal, just enough to not seem rude. But then he started showing up at my locker before shifts, waiting there like it was our meeting spot. He would ask if I wanted to walk to the floor together, and when I said I needed to use the restroom first, he would still be there when I came back. My coworker Elise noticed before I did. She pulled me aside one night and said that Curtis had been asking other people questions about me, whether I had a boyfriend, where I lived, what my schedule looked like. I tried to create distance after that. Started taking my breaks at different times, eating my lunch in my car instead of the break room, switching my locker to the row closer to the supervisor's office. For about 2 weeks it seemed to work. Curtis would still wave at me from across the floor, still try to catch my eye when we passed each other near the loading docks. But he kept his distance. I thought maybe he had gotten the message. Maybe he had found someone else to fixate on. Maybe I had been overthinking the whole thing. Then came the night he sat down next to me in the parking lot. I was in my car with the windows cracked, eating a sandwich and scrolling through my phone, when the passenger door opened and he just climbed in. No knock, no asking permission. He sat down in my passenger seat like we had planned to meet there, like this was something we did every night. He had a bag of chips in his hand and he offered me some, smiling with those thin, colorless lips. And I was so stunned that I did not say anything for a full 5 seconds. I told him he needed to get out of my car. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to, almost like a question instead of a demand. Curtis laughed, that same delayed chuckle, and said he just wanted to keep me company, said he noticed I always ate alone and that it made him sad to see. I repeated myself, louder this time, and something in his expression shifted. It was subtle, just a flicker behind his eyes, but I saw irritation there, maybe even anger. He held up his hands in mock surrender and said he was just trying to be friendly, that I did not need to be so hostile about it. Then he got out, slow and deliberate, and stood outside my window for a moment before walking away. He did not look back, but I watched him cross the parking lot in my rearview mirror, and I noticed that his hands were balled into fists at his sides. I locked my doors and sat there until my break was over, my sandwich untouched on my lap. The next few shifts were quiet, almost too quiet. Curtis avoided me entirely, would not even look in my direction when we crossed paths on the floor. I told myself that the car incident had finally gotten through to him, that he understood now that I wanted nothing to do with him. Elise was not so sure. She said men like Curtis did not just give up, that they stewed and planned and waited. I thought she was being paranoid. Then a new hire named Becca started on our shift. Young, maybe 19 or 20, fresh out of high school with braces still on her teeth. She worked the station next to mine, and on her third night she asked me a question that made my throat tighten. She wanted to know if it was true, what Curtis had told her during orientation. She said he had mentioned that we used to date, that things had ended badly, that I had a habit of leading men on. Her voice was curious, not accusatory, like she was just trying to get the gossip straight. I told Becca that none of it was true, that Curtis and I had never dated, that I had barely spoken 10 sentences to him in total. She looked confused, said that he had been pretty detailed about it, mentioned specific dates we had supposedly gone on, restaurants we had eaten at together, even described a necklace he claimed to have bought me for my birthday. I felt sick listening to her recount these fabrications. The level of detail he had invented was disturbing, like he had constructed an entire relationship in his mind and was now presenting it as fact to anyone who would listen. Becca apologized, said she had no idea, said Curtis had seemed so sincere when he talked about it. I asked her who else he had told these stories to. She said she was not sure, but that he had been chatting with pretty much everyone during the orientation sessions that week. There had been 6 new hires altogether, and Curtis had apparently made himself their unofficial welcome committee. Over the next several days, I started noticing the looks. Whispers that stopped when I walked into the break room. Small groups of newer employees glancing at me and then quickly looking away. One guy from receiving, barely out of his teens, actually winked at me when I passed him near the loading bay, and when I asked him what that was about, he just laughed and said Curtis had told him I was a lot of fun. I did not understand what he meant at first. Then Elise pulled me aside again and told me what she had overheard in the women's restroom. 2 of the new hires had been talking about me, sharing stories that Curtis had apparently told them in graphic detail. Stories about things I had supposedly done with him, Intimate things, explicit things, described with enough specificity that they sounded almost believable. One of the girls had mentioned a birthmark on my lower back, something Curtis could not possibly have known about unless he had seen me undressed, which he absolutely had not. I confronted Curtis that same night, found him by the vending machines during second break, alone for once, feeding quarters into the slot for a candy bar. I asked him what he thought he was doing, why he was telling people these lies, where he had even gotten the detail about the birthmark. He turned around slowly, that infuriating half-smile on his face, and said he had no idea what I was talking about. I told him I knew exactly what he had been saying, that multiple people had come to me with his stories, that this was harassment and I was going to report him. The smile did not waver. He leaned in closer, close enough that I could smell the menthol on his breath, and said that it was his word against mine, and that everyone already believed him. Then he said something that made my entire body go rigid. He described the birthmark again, its exact shape and location, and then he described something else, a small scar on my hip from a childhood bike accident, something not even my closest friends knew about. He said he had seen everything, and that I should be more careful about leaving my gym bag unattended in the locker room. I went straight to the shift supervisor after that conversation. His name was Gary Fonseca, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had been running the night crew for over a decade. I sat in his cramped office with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead and told him everything: the unwanted attention, the invasion of my car, the fabricated stories, the intimate details Curtis could only have obtained by going through my personal belongings. Gary listened with his arms crossed, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he let out a long breath and said he would look into it. Said he took these things seriously. Said I should document everything from now on. But then he added something that made my heart sink. He said Curtis had been with the company for almost 15 years, that he had never had a single complaint against him, that some of the things I was describing sounded like misunderstandings. He asked if maybe I had given Curtis mixed signals without realizing it. I left his office feeling smaller than when I had walked in. The documentation became my obsession after that. I started carrying a small notebook in my vest pocket, writing down every interaction, every look, every comment I overheard. I saved text messages from coworkers who told me what Curtis was saying behind my back. I even asked Elise to write a statement about what she had witnessed, which she did without hesitation. Within 2 weeks, I had filled half the notebook with incidents. Times Curtis had followed me to my car after shift. Times he had shown up in aisles where I was working alone. Times new employees had approached me with increasingly disturbing versions of his stories. The rumors had evolved by then. He was no longer just claiming we had dated. Now he was telling people we were still seeing each other in secret, that I was engaged to someone else but could not stay away from him, that I had begged him not to tell anyone about our arrangement. One of the newer guys asked me point blank if it was true that I had a thing for older men, and when I said absolutely not, he just shrugged and said Curtis had shown him pictures. That was when I knew I had to go above Gary. The pictures changed everything. I contacted corporate HR directly, sent them an email with scanned pages from my notebook, attached the written statements from Elise and 2 other coworkers who had come forward, and explained that my direct supervisor had dismissed my concerns. The response came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, an HR representative named Claudia drove up from the regional office to conduct interviews. She spoke to me first, then to Elise, then to several of the newer employees who had heard Curtis spreading his stories. She also pulled the security footage from the parking lot, which clearly showed Curtis entering my vehicle without permission on the night he had climbed into my car. When she finally sat down with Curtis himself, the interview lasted almost 2 hours. I do not know exactly what was said in that room, but I know that when Curtis walked out, his face was the color of old newspaper. He did not look at anyone. He went straight to his locker, gathered his things, and left the building. Claudia told me later that the pictures he had been showing people were photos he had taken of me from a distance, Candid shots of me walking to my car, bending over to pick something up, standing at my workstation. Nothing explicit, but invasive enough to constitute grounds for immediate termination. Curtis was fired that same week. I learned through the grapevine that he had tried to fight it, claimed that the photos were innocent, claimed that I had led him on and then turned vindictive when he rejected me. But the documentation I had gathered was too thorough, the witness statements too consistent, and the security footage too damning. The last I heard, he had moved out of state. Someone said he had family in New Mexico, though I never bothered to verify it. I stayed at Holbrook for another year after that, long enough to watch the rumors fade and the new hires stop looking at me like I was some kind of scandal. Elise got promoted to team lead and made sure I was never scheduled anywhere near receiving, where Curtis used to work. I eventually left for a better job at a medical supply company across town, somewhere with daylight hours and no locker rooms. Sometimes I still think about those weeks when Curtis was constructing his fantasy version of me, telling strangers intimate details he had pieced together from stolen glances and rifled belongings. I think about how easily people believed him, how quickly a reputation can be dismantled by someone willing to lie with enough conviction. Keep my car doors locked now, even in my own driveway. I check behind me when I walk through parking lots at night. Some habits are hard to break once someone teaches you why they matter. Friday nights at Bronco Burger were always chaos, but I had learned to love the rhythm of it. Orders flying, timers beeping, the smell of grease permanently embedded in my work shirts. My high school class graduated in 2015, and while most of my friends had moved on to office jobs or college degrees, I had climbed my way up from fry cook to shift supervisor at the busiest location in Albuquerque. It was not glamorous, but it paid the bills for my apartment and kept me busy enough that I did not have time to overthink my life choices. That particular Friday in March felt like any other, until a new hire named Curtis Weaver walked through the back door for his first closing shift. He was maybe a few years older than me, with a weathered look that suggested he had seen more than his share of rough nights. The hiring manager had brought him on last minute to cover a staffing gap, and I did not think much of it at first. Curtis kept his head down those first couple of hours, which I actually appreciated. New hires who talked too much usually burned the patties or forgot to restock the napkin dispensers. But there was something particular about the way he moved through the restaurant, always positioning himself away from certain spots. When I asked him to cover the drive-through window so Megan could take her break, he immediately suggested he could handle the grill instead. I figured maybe he just felt more comfortable with cooking than customer interaction. Some people are like that. But then I noticed he never walked past the front counter cameras when he could avoid it. He would take the long way around through the storage hallway just to get to the freezer. During his smoke breaks, he stood pressed against the brick wall in a spot where the parking lot cameras could not reach. I told myself he was probably just one of those guys with social anxiety, maybe self-conscious about being recorded. Plenty of people hate cameras. Still, a small part of my brain filed it away as odd. A week passed, and Curtis showed up for every shift on time, worked hard, never complained. I started to think I had been paranoid for nothing. He was quiet, sure, but he was reliable. And in fast food, reliable is worth its weight in gold. Then came the Tuesday night that changed everything. We were slammed until around 9, and after the rush finally died down, I headed to the break room to grab my energy drink from the mini fridge. The door was slightly open, and I pushed through without thinking. Curtis was sitting at the small table with his phone in his hands, and the second he saw me, he practically slapped the screen against his chest. His whole body went rigid, like a kid caught looking at something he should not be seeing. I put my hands up and laughed, told him to relax, I was just grabbing my drink. But I had already seen a flash of what was on his screen before he hit it. A news website, some kind of article with a mugshot photo at the top. He mumbled something about just checking the weather and shoved his phone into his pocket. I nodded, grabbed my drink and walked out. But the image stuck with me. A mugshot, a headline in bold red letters. Why would anyone react that way to a weather app? That night, after we locked up and I drove home to my apartment on Copper Avenue, I could not stop thinking about it. I kept telling myself it was none of my business. Maybe he had a family member in trouble with the law. Maybe he was reading about a friend. There were 100 innocent explanations, but something in the way his face had drained of color when he saw me, that was not embarrassment. That was fear. Real, animal fear. The kind you see in someone who thinks they have been caught. I barely slept that night, replaying the moment over and over in my head. The next few shifts, I watched Curtis more carefully. Not obviously. I did not want him to notice. But I paid attention. And that is when the questions started. It began small, almost casual. He asked me how often the Cisco truck came with supplies, and I told him Wednesdays and Saturdays, usually around 6 in the morning before we opened. He nodded like he was just making conversation. Then 2 nights later, while we were mopping the floors after close, he asked if the manager always counted the safe at the same time. I told him yeah, every night at 11:15, right before the final deposit. He laughed and said he was just curious about how things worked around here, wanted to understand the routine. But there was something behind his eyes when he asked, a sharpness that did not match the casual tone of his voice. I started keeping mental notes of every question he asked, and by the end of that week, the list had grown long enough to make my stomach turn. Thursday night was when things got worse. We were alone in the back, restocking the walk-in freezer, and Curtis leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. He asked me, real quiet, whether the back door alarm still glitched sometimes. I stopped what I was doing and looked at him, told him I did not know what he meant. He shrugged and said he had heard one of the other employees mention that the alarm on the emergency exit had a problem, that sometimes it did not go off right away when the door opened. I lied and told him they had fixed it months ago, that it worked fine now. He just nodded, but I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. He was testing me, trying to figure out if I knew something, or maybe trying to figure out if the building had a weakness he could exploit. When I got home that night, I locked my apartment door, sat on my couch, and finally typed his name into Google, Curtis Weaver. Nothing came up except some random LinkedIn profiles and a high school football coach from Tennessee. Whoever this guy was, Curtis Weaver was not his real name. I spent the next hour digging through everything I could find. I remembered the flash of that news article, the mugshot, the red headline. So I started searching for armed robberies in New Mexico from the past few months. Nothing matched. I expanded the search to neighboring states, Arizona, Texas, Colorado. That is when I found it. A news story from a local station in Las Cruces about an armed robbery at a sandwich shop 3 towns over from where I lived. 2 men had walked in just before closing, held the employees at gunpoint, and emptied the safe. One of the robbers had been caught a week later, but the other one had vanished. The article included a photo from the security camera, grainy but clear enough. The man in the image had the same narrow face, the same high cheekbones, the same way of holding his shoulders slightly hunched forward. But what made my chest tighten was the tattoo. On the side of his neck, partially visible in the security footage, was a tattoo of a snake coiled around a dagger. I had seen that exact tattoo on Curtis when he leaned over the fryer, his collar pulling to the side. There was no doubt in my mind anymore. I was working closing shifts with a wanted man. I barely made it to the bathroom before I threw up. My mind was racing through every interaction I had with him, every time we had been alone in the building together. He had asked about the safe. He had asked about the delivery schedule. He had asked about the alarm. This was not paranoia, this was a pattern. He was planning something, and I was the idiot who had been answering his questions like we were just coworkers making small talk. I sat on my bathroom floor for 20 minutes trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police right then, but I had no real proof. A grainy photo and a tattoo would not be enough. And if I was wrong, if somehow this was all a terrible coincidence, I could ruin an innocent man's life. But deep down, I knew I was not wrong. The way he hid from cameras, the fake name, the specific questions about our security vulnerabilities. Curtis, or whatever his real name was, had picked Bronco Burger as his next target, and I had 3 more closing shifts with him that week. Friday came, and I drove to work with a knot in my stomach so tight I could barely breathe. I had spent the previous night reading everything I could find about the robbery. The man who got caught had taken a plea deal and was serving 8 years. His partner, the one still missing, was identified as Darren Schofield, 31 years old with prior arrests for assault and breaking and entering. The fugitive alert had been issued 2 months ago, and police believed he had fled the state. But he had not fled anywhere. He was standing at the grill station when I walked in, flipping patties like he did not have a care in the world. I clocked in, put on my headset, and tried to act normal. Every time he looked at me, I felt like he could see right through my face, like he knew that I knew. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to just get through the shift. Megan was working drive-through and a kid named Jordan was handling the front counter. As long as there were other people around, I figured I was safe. But then Megan asked if she could leave an hour early because her sister was having car trouble, and I heard myself say yes before I could think it through. By 10:30, it was just me, Jordan, and Darren in the building. Jordan was 17, skinny, more interested in his phone than in any potential danger. He had no idea what was happening. I positioned myself near the front counter, close to the panic button we had installed under the register. After a string of robberies hit fast food joints across the city a few years back. I watched Darren from the corner of my eye as he wiped down tables in the dining area. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall, and every glance made my pulse spike higher. At 10:45, he walked toward the back of the restaurant, toward the manager's office where the safe was kept. I called out and asked where he was going. He turned around with this easy smile and said he was just grabbing more napkins from storage. But the napkin boxes were in the opposite direction, near the walk-in freezer. He knew that. I knew that. And in that moment, we both knew that the other one was lying. I made a decision right there. I told Jordan to take his break early, to go sit in his car for 15 minutes and call his girlfriend or whatever he wanted to do. The kid did not argue. He grabbed his phone and walked out the front door without a second thought. As soon as he was gone, I turned to Darren and told him we needed to talk. He stopped walking and faced me, his expression shifting from that fake casual smile to something harder, something colder. I told him I knew who he was. I told him I had seen the article about Las Cruces, and I had seen the fugitive alert with his real face on it. For a long second, neither of us moved. Then he took a step toward me, and I took a step back, my hand sliding under the counter toward the panic button. I told him that if he took one more step, I would press the button and the police would be here in 4 minutes. He stopped. His jaw tightened, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing his options, figuring out if he could reach me before I reached the button. I kept talking, kept my voice steady even though my heart was slamming against my ribs. I told him he could walk out the back door right now and disappear, and I would not press anything until he had a 5-minute head start. I did not want to be a hero. I just wanted to survive the night. He stared at me for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 seconds. Then he laughed, this low, hollow sound that had no humor in it, and shook his head. He called me smart, said most people would have just kept their mouths shut and hoped for the best. Then he turned around, walked through the kitchen and pushed open the back door. The alarm went off, that high-pitched screech filling the empty restaurant, and I watched him disappear into the darkness of the parking lot behind the building. I waited until I could not see him anymore. Then I pressed the panic button anyway. The police showed up 11 minutes later and I told them everything. They put out an alert, searched the area, but Darren Schofield was gone. A detective told me I had done the right thing, that confronting him directly was dangerous but probably saved my life, and Jordan's too. I quit Bronco Burger 2 weeks later. I could not stand being in that building anymore, jumping every time the back door opened, flinching every time a new hire walked in. They caught Darren 4 months later in a motel outside of Tucson, trying to pull the same routine at a gas station. I read about it online and felt this strange mix of relief and lingering dread. Sometimes I still think about that moment when we stood there staring at each other, both of us knowing the truth. I got lucky that night. He decided I was not worth the risk, but I will never forget the look in his eyes when he was deciding, that cold, empty calculation, like he was measuring whether my life was worth more than his freedom. I hope I never see a look like that again. Closing shifts at Baxter's Home Goods were never anyone's idea of a good time, but I needed the extra hours that spring. My older brother had just gotten married the month before, and somewhere between the bachelor party and the wedding gift, my savings account had taken a serious hit. At 26, watching your siblings settle into adulthood while you still eat cereal for dinner most nights does something to your self-esteem. So picking up shifts felt like the least pathetic way to get back on track. The store was one of those massive warehouse-style places on the outskirts of Fredericksburg, Virginia, surrounded by nothing but a half-empty parking lot and a Taco Bell that closed at 10. That Wednesday night in April 2018, the schedule had me paired with Wanda for closing duties, which meant mopping floors, restocking shelves, and counting registers until almost midnight. I did not mind working with her, even though most people on the team found her a little strange. Wanda had transferred to our location about 4 months earlier from a store somewhere in Delaware, and she kept mostly to herself in a way that felt less antisocial and more like she was carrying something heavy she did not want to talk about. She was maybe 15 years older than me, with graying hair she kept in a tight bun and these deep-set eyes that always seemed to be looking past whatever was right in front of her. People in the break room whispered that she had left an abusive marriage, though nobody knew for sure, and I never asked. What I did know was that she worked harder than anyone else on the floor, never complained about staying late, and had this habit of triple-checking the locks before leaving like she expected someone to be waiting outside. That night, she seemed more on edge than usual, dropping her keys twice while we finished the registers and flinching hard when a car alarm went off in the parking lot. When I asked if she was okay, she just nodded quickly and said something about not sleeping well lately. I should have paid more attention to the way her hands trembled when she said it. We finished closing around 11:45, and I walked Wanda out to her car like I always did. The parking lot had that eerie orange glow from the sodium lights, and our footsteps echoed louder than they should have against the empty asphalt. Her old Nissan Sentra sat alone near the back of the lot, which I always thought was a weird choice since there were plenty of spots closer to the door. When she tried to start it, the engine made this grinding sound, and then nothing. She tried again, same result. I could see her grip tightening on the steering wheel, knuckles going white, and for a second I thought she might start crying. I offered to give her a jump, but after checking under the hood, it was clear the battery was not the problem. Something mechanical had given out, and neither of us knew enough about cars to figure out what. She sat there staring at the dashboard like it had personally betrayed her, and I felt terrible just leaving her stranded in that empty lot close to midnight. That is when I made the offer that changed everything about that night. I told her I could drive her home, that it was no big deal, that she could call a tow truck in the morning when places were actually open. She hesitated for a long moment, looking around the parking lot like she was scanning for something in the shadows, and then finally agreed with a quiet thank you that barely reached my ears. The drive to her apartment complex took about 20 minutes, and she spent most of it staring out the passenger window without saying a word. I tried to make small talk about work stuff, about the new inventory system everyone hated, about our manager's annoying habit of scheduling meetings during lunch breaks. She gave one-word answers at best, and after a while I just let the silence fill the car. When we pulled into her complex, this rundown 3-story building with flickering hallway lights, she asked if I could walk her to her door. Said she did not like walking through the building alone at night. Something in her voice made it impossible to say no. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway that smelled like mildew and cigarette smoke. The carpet was this faded brown color with stains I did not want to think about, and half the lights along the ceiling were either burned out or buzzing like dying insects. Wanda walked fast, her keys already in her hand, checking each door we passed like she expected one of them to swing open. When we reached her unit, number 312, she fumbled with the lock for what felt like forever before finally getting it open. She stepped inside and flicked on the light, then turned to thank me for the ride. I was about to say goodnight and head back to my car when she grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to stop me. She asked if I could just come in for a minute, said she wanted to make sure everything was okay inside before I left. Her eyes had this desperate look that I had never seen at work, like she was holding back something much bigger than what she was saying. Against every instinct telling me to go home, I stepped inside. The apartment was small and sparse, just a living room connected to a tiny kitchen, with a single door that I assumed led to the bedroom. The furniture looked secondhand, a sagging couch with floral print, a coffee table with water rings on the surface, and a television that had to be at least 15 years old. What struck me was how clean everything was despite looking worn out, like she spent hours scrubbing surfaces that would never look new again. There were no pictures on the walls, no decorations, nothing personal at all except for a small ceramic cat figurine sitting on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. Wanda locked the door behind us, and I heard her slide the deadbolt, then a chain lock, then what sounded like a secondary bolt near the floor. 3 locks for a tiny apartment in a rundown complex seemed excessive, but I did not say anything. She walked through the space quickly, checking the bedroom, the closet, even pulling back the shower curtain in the bathroom. When she came back to the living room, she let out this long breath like she had been holding it the whole time. That is when I said I should probably get going, that it was getting late. And that is when everything changed. Wanda was standing between me and the door when her face just crumbled. There is no other way to describe it. 1 second she looked relieved, and the next her expression twisted into something raw and terrified, like she had suddenly remembered something horrible. She started mumbling under her breath, words I could not quite catch, and her eyes darted to the window like she had heard something outside. I asked her what was wrong, and she grabbed both my arms with a strength that surprised me, her fingernails digging into my skin through my jacket. She said he had found her. She said he was here, that he had been following her for weeks, watching her at work, waiting in the parking lot. I asked who, and she just shook her head violently, tears starting to stream down her face. She said I could not leave, that if I opened that door he would get in, that he was probably in the hallway right now. I tried to stay calm, told her we could call the police if someone was stalking her, but she almost screamed when I said that. She said the police never helped, that they never believed her, that last time she called them they treated her like she was crazy and let him walk free. I did not know what to do. Part of me wanted to believe her, because the fear on her face was so genuine it made my chest tight. But another part of me was starting to realize that something was very wrong with Wanda herself, not just her situation. She kept pacing between the door and the window, peeking through the blinds every few seconds, muttering about how he always found her no matter where she went. I tried to inch toward the door, said I could check the hallway to make sure no one was there, but she practically threw herself in front of it. She begged me not to open it, said that was exactly what he wanted, that he was waiting for one of us to step out. Her voice had this cracked, desperate quality that I had only ever heard in movies about people losing their grip on reality. I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, and she slapped it out of my hand so fast I did not even see her move. It hit the floor and slid under the couch, and she stood there breathing hard, saying she was sorry but I did not understand, that phones were how he tracked her, that he had people everywhere listening. That was the moment I understood I was trapped in that apartment with someone who was genuinely unwell, and I had no idea how I was going to get out. The next hour was one of the longest of my life. Wanda kept moving around the apartment like a caged animal, checking the window, pressing her ear against the door, whispering things I could not hear. I sat on the couch trying to figure out my options, but every time I shifted my weight or made any movement toward the door, she would snap her attention to me with this look that made me stay perfectly still. Around 1 in the morning, she went into the kitchen and came back holding a knife. Not a small one either, but a proper chef's knife with a blade that caught the dim light from the ceiling fixture. She was not pointing it at me, just holding it at her side, but my whole body went cold seeing it in her hand. She said it was for protection, that if he broke through the door, she needed to be ready. I told her to put it down, that she was scaring me, and she looked at me with these hollow eyes and said I was the only person she could trust, that everyone else had abandoned her, that I was the only one who understood. I did not understand anything except that I needed to get out of there before the situation got worse. She started talking then, really talking, and I let her because I thought maybe if she got whatever was inside her out, she might calm down enough for me to leave. She told me about her ex-husband, a man named Craig who she said had been hunting her since she left him 3 years ago. She said he was connected, that he had friends in law enforcement, that he could find her anywhere she went no matter how many times she moved or changed jobs. Some of what she said sounded plausible at first, the way abusers sometimes do stalk their victims, the way the system fails women who try to escape. But then she started saying things that made less sense, like how Craig could hear through walls, how he had put something in her food once that let him track her heartbeat, how he had hired people at every job she ever worked to report back on her movements. She said the car breaking down was not an accident, that he had done something to it, that he wanted her stranded and vulnerable. Every few minutes she would stop mid-sentence and hold up her hand for silence, convinced she had heard footsteps in the hall or breathing outside the window. Each time there was nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. By 3 in the morning, I had been in that apartment for nearly 4 hours. My legs were cramping from sitting in the same position, afraid to move too much, and my eyes burned from exhaustion and the effort of staying alert. Wanda had finally stopped pacing and sat down in a chair facing the door, the knife resting across her lap like some kind of guardian talisman. She kept talking, but her words were getting slower, slurring together in ways that made it hard to follow. She would trail off in the middle of sentences, stare at nothing for minutes at a time, then suddenly jerk back to alertness and repeat something she had already said twice before. I realized she probably had not slept in days, maybe longer, and the exhaustion was finally starting to win against whatever adrenaline had been keeping her going. I stayed quiet, kept my breathing steady, and watched her eyelids grow heavier. Every time her chin would dip toward her chest, my heart would pound with the possibility of escape, and every time she would snap back awake and look around the room with wild confusion. But the intervals between those moments started getting longer, her head staying down for 30 seconds, then a minute, then longer still. I do not know exactly what time it was when I finally moved, maybe close to 4 in the morning. Wanda had gone completely still in the chair, her breathing deep and rhythmic, the knife still in her lap, but her grip on it loose. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching her chest rise and fall, terrified that any sound would bring her back. When I finally stood up, my knees almost buckled from being locked in place so long, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from making a noise. I moved toward the door one slow step at a time, avoiding the spots on the floor where I remembered the wood had creaked earlier. The deadbolt made a soft click when I turned it, and I held my breath so hard my chest ached. The chain lock was harder, my fingers clumsy and sweating, but I managed to slide it free without the metal rattling. I did not look back at her. I just opened the door as slowly as I could, slipped through the gap sideways, and eased it shut behind me. Then I walked down that dark hallway faster than I have ever walked anywhere in my life, took the stairs 2 at a time, and did not stop until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine running. I drove straight home and sat in my parking lot until the sun came up, too wired to sleep, too shaken to do anything but replay the whole night in my head. When the store opened that morning, I called my manager and told him everything. He got quiet for a long moment, then said he would handle it. Turns out Wanda had a history that none of us knew about, episodes like this that had happened at her previous job before the transfer. The company had some kind of agreement with her, accommodations or something. But clearly whatever support system she had was not working anymore. She never came back to work after that night. I heard through another coworker a few weeks later that her family had come to get her, that she was getting help somewhere. But I never got details, and I did not ask for them. Part of me felt guilty for running, for not calling someone to check on her, for just saving myself and leaving her alone in that apartment. But another part of me knew that staying could have ended in a way I do not want to think about. That the knife in her lap was real even if the man in the hallway was not. I still think about Wanda sometimes, especially on nights when I have to close alone or walk through an empty parking lot after dark. I think about how fear can break a person so completely that they become the thing others need to fear. I think about how close I came to being in the wrong place at the wrong moment, when her mind finally snapped all the way. It took me months to stop checking my rearview mirror on the drive home from work, to stop flinching when someone grabbed my arm unexpectedly. I never found out what really happened to her, whether the ex-husband was real or just another part of the delusion, whether she ever got better, or if that night was just one stop on a longer fall. What I do know is that I got lucky. I got to walk out of that apartment, get in my car, and drive away from the worst night of my life. Not everyone gets that chance, and I have never forgotten it. Working nights at that small highway hotel had become a strange sort of comfort for me. My schedule was upside down compared to most people I knew, but I liked the quiet. The building sat beside a long stretch of road where trucks hummed past like slow waves, and most nights were uneventful enough that I brought a thermos and a crossword book just to stay awake. At the time, I was juggling online classes and paying off some bills, so the solitude actually worked in my favor. Guests rarely wandered in after midnight, and the handful already checked in usually kept to themselves, so I had hours of stillness where my thoughts were louder than the lobby TV playing reruns. My maintenance coworker, a guy named Caleb, had the opposite kind of presence, always fidgeting, always pacing, always muttering little reminders to himself. During the day, he seemed harmless enough, but nights tended to stretch people thin, and he often looked like he hadn't fully stepped out of whatever dream he'd been having before his shift. That particular night started out ordinary. I had just finished logging a late arrival and was wiping down the counter when I heard a heavy scraping sound coming from the east hallway, the one lined with vending machines and utility closets. At first, I figured a guest was dragging their suitcase, but the noise kept going, long and uneven, like something wooden being pulled over tile. When I stepped closer, I saw Caleb at the far end of the hallway, bracing his shoulder against a lobby armchair and pushing it toward the wall as if he needed it in a specific spot. The thing that threw me off was the angle. It was wedged halfway between two doors, facing nothing, like he was arranging a stage set, only he understood. He didn't acknowledge me, not even with a nod, and that was unusual because he normally rambled about whatever task he was on. As he straightened the chair, he tilted his head slightly, murmuring to the empty space beside him. I couldn't make out his words, but the rhythm of them felt too deliberate to be random self-talk. For a moment, I wondered if he had Bluetooth earbuds in, but his ears were bare. I tried approaching in a casual way, just to check if everything was okay, but before I'd even finished asking, he jerked around like I had shouted in his ear. His eyes darted past me, scanning the hallway and the ceiling as though he expected someone to step out. "They're here, aren't they?" he asked, voice low and uneven. I honestly thought he was joking, some weird attempt at humor, until he glanced at the wall panels with this jittery suspicion that made my pulse pick up. When he stepped closer, I noticed the end of a metal handle sticking out from inside his sleeve, barely hidden by the cuff of his work shirt. It took me a second to recognize the shape, long, narrow, with those faint grip ridges. A screwdriver. And suddenly the scattered details I'd been ignoring started clicking into place. The unplugged cameras, the shifting furniture, the doors he'd been checking all week. He stepped back from me like he needed more space to think, rubbing his thumb over the concealed handle in his sleeve, almost absent-mindedly. His gaze kept drifting to the lobby entrance behind me, and that's when I remembered the odd clicking sound I'd heard earlier, like metal tapping against metal. At the time, I shrugged it off as part of his routine checks. Now it occurred to me that I hadn't heard the door latch engage properly in a while. A cold, steady awareness settled in my mind. Not panic, but a kind of forced clarity. If he had been removing hinges or tampering with the locks, I might not be able to get out easily if things escalated. The idea made me straighten a little, like my body was quietly telling me to stay alert without drawing attention to it. Caleb started talking again, this time in a sharper voice, pointing at the drywall like it held answers only he could interpret. "You think I don't hear them?" he said. "You think I don't know you brought them in?" The way he spoke wasn't angry at first. It was more desperate, the kind of tone someone uses when they're trying to piece together a puzzle that keeps shifting around. But when I told him nobody else was here, that the hall was empty, the rooms booked but silent, his expression tightened in a way that made my heart thud. He leaned closer to the wall, tracing a line along the seam where two panels met, whispering something under his breath, as if someone behind the plaster was whispering back. I tried to keep my voice steady, suggesting maybe we should step into the brighter part of the lobby so he could show me what he meant. My goal wasn't to argue or correct him, just to bring him into a space where I had a little more room to react. Instead, he moved the other direction. He crouched near the base of the hallway door to the laundry room, poking his fingers into the hinge pocket like he was checking his progress. When he stood again, the screwdriver had slipped fully into view, and I could see faint scuff marks on the metal frame, like he'd been loosening the hardware for hours. There were similar marks on at least 3 other doors nearby, ones I had assumed were from routine maintenance. I suddenly felt very aware of every exit in the building and how many ways they might no longer behave like exits. He stood up and faced me again, his stance tight, breathing uneven. "They're behind you right now," he said softly, and the certainty in his tone made my chest tighten in a way I can't even describe. I didn't turn around. I knew there was no one there. Instead, I kept my hands visible and open at my sides, slowly stepping backward toward the front desk. The hall lights buzzed overhead, flickering the way they sometimes did when the wiring acted up. But in that moment, every flicker felt intentional. Caleb's attention snapped back and forth between me and the empty space above my shoulder, and the intensity in his eyes made it clear that if he believed I was part of whatever he thought was happening, he wouldn't hesitate to act on it. Reaching the lobby felt like crossing into different air, even though nothing had actually changed. The front desk light cast a wider glow, and the windows at least gave me a sense of space, even if the highway outside was empty. I kept my voice calm, telling him we could call the manager together if he thought someone had been sneaking around. The suggestion set him off again. He shook his head quickly, muttering about how a call would alert them. He started pacing between the coffee station and the hallway entrance, gripping the screwdriver in a way he probably didn't even realize. For a moment, I wondered if I should dash out the front door, but the memory of those metal clicks stopped me. If he had really messed with the hinges, yanking on the door might just make him panic further. And panic wasn't something I could afford from him. Instead, I asked if he wanted to check the boiler room with me, pretending I'd heard something strange earlier. It wasn't a brilliant plan, but I needed him to move away from the lobby exit. His steps slowed, and he looked at me like he was trying to decode whether I was lying. The silence stretched long enough that the hum of the vending machine sounded unnaturally loud. Then he nodded, just once, and told me I should walk ahead. That single request chilled me more than anything else that night. I couldn't lead him deeper into the building, not with that tool in his hand and that erratic suspicion flickering across his face. So I pointed to the fire panel on the wall and lied, saying the boiler room key wasn't on the ring. It had been moved to the office safe. I told him he could check himself if he didn't believe me. The office door was beside the desk, and as soon as he turned toward it, his focus tunneled in on the keypad like it held the final proof he needed. He stepped closer, tapping his fingers along the metal edge, whispering to whoever he thought stood beside him. I took that moment, just a few seconds where his back angled away, and slipped to the lobby door. I pressed the push bar slowly, expecting resistance, but it gave way with a soft click I hadn't heard in days. Maybe he hadn't gotten to that hinge yet. Maybe luck finally decided to cooperate. Either way, I stepped through, letting the door rest against its frame without letting it slam. I didn't run until I reached the far end of the parking lot, where the glow of the sign lit the pavement like a pale spotlight. The police arrived faster than I expected after I called from my car, and they handled things in a way that made me realize how close the situation had been to spiraling into something worse. They found several door hinges loosened, a handful of lock plates removed, and 2 unplugged cameras tucked neatly into a cart he'd been pushing earlier. Caleb didn't resist when they approached him. He just kept staring at the walls as if someone was about to step out from them. I never got a clear explanation about what he believed was happening, and maybe he never had one himself. The building eventually got new staff and updated security, and I found a different job not long after. Even now, though, whenever I walk past a door with a hinge slightly out of place or hear the scrape of furniture on tile, a part of me remembers how easily a familiar space can shift into something dangerous without anyone noticing until it's almost too late. Most of my life has been a mix of odd jobs, and that particular winter I'd picked up a seasonal shift at a warehouse outside a small town where I was renting a second-floor unit in an aging apartment complex. My schedule had flipped upside down because of holiday demand, so I'd been working late nights, finishing around midnight or a little after. The place itself had that industrial smell of cardboard dust and cheap heater vents, and everyone walked around half awake, trading jokes just to stay moving. I kept mostly to myself, sharing quick conversations during breaks but never getting too close to anyone. That's probably why I didn't notice right away how one specific coworker had inserted himself into almost every end-of-shift routine. His name was Darren, quiet at first glance but always drifting toward whoever seemed tired or distracted. The habit started small. He'd casually offer to walk people to their cars in the back lot since the area wasn't well lit, and sometimes felt uneasy after midnight. Most folks didn't think twice about it, accepting the company if they didn't want to cross the icy pavement alone. He had this way of lingering near the punch-out station, waiting until someone else grabbed their stuff so he could fall in step behind them. One night, while we were putting pallets away, he started asking questions that felt oddly specific for such a casual chat. He asked another coworker, a guy named Travis, how far he lived from the highway, then asked if he lived alone or with roommates. The question sounded almost like he was preparing a survey, but without any normal reason behind it. Travis laughed it off, but I remember the way Darren watched him afterward, like he was storing the answers somewhere in his head. I figured maybe he was awkward socially, or trying too hard to make small talk, until he turned the same line of questioning toward me during break. He asked which direction I drove home, then asked if my building had underground parking or street parking. He went further than that, asking whether my neighbors were home often, and if people tended to leave their lights on late. He said it all like he was discussing weather patterns, totally casual, but something in the pacing of his questions felt unnatural. I tried answering vaguely without giving anything real. I mentioned traffic lights and general streets but kept it broad. He nodded along like he understood exactly where I lived, even though I'd been intentionally unclear. What bothered me wasn't the questions themselves, but how invested he seemed in each answer, like he was assembling a map. The night everything shifted happened after a long shift of sorting incoming shipments. Most of us clocked out at the same time and headed toward the back exit. I walked out with another coworker, Jenna, and we chatted a bit while the cold air hit us. Once she drove off, I noticed Darren standing near the dumpster enclosure beside the exit door. He wasn't smoking, wasn't on his phone, wasn't doing anything at all, just watching the parking lot. The lights from the warehouse cast this dull glow on him, and despite having clocked out at least 10 minutes before me, he hadn't left. I tried not to think too much of it, unlocked my car, and got inside. When I glanced in the rearview mirror before pulling out, he was still there, barely moving. his focus fixed on the rows of vehicles like he was waiting for something specific. As the sun came up the next morning, I was barely awake when someone started pounding on the door of the warehouse office before our shift began. Everyone looked around, confused, until a supervisor hurried over and opened it. 2 police officers stepped inside, their coats dusted with frost, and asked if they could speak with whoever had access to the overnight schedule. The room went quiet in that way where you can practically hear people thinking. One of the officers mentioned a break-in at an apartment complex across town. Windows smashed, door forced. A resident startled awake by noises in the hallway. They said the suspect had been seen by a neighbor earlier in the night walking between buildings, checking which units had lights on and which didn't. I wasn't paying full attention until they described the complex, down to the weird bent railing by the stairwell. That was where I lived, and I had never mentioned that to anyone there. Our supervisor pointed them toward the manager's office, where they could pull the schedule and see who had left early or taken breaks at specific times. People started murmuring, wondering why the police were even here if the break-in was somewhere else in town. But I just stood there feeling a strange pressure in my chest, replaying the awkward questions Darren had asked. I tried to stay calm, but my mind kept circling back to the way he lingered outside the night before, watching cars leave one by one. When the officers stepped back out, they asked if anyone had noticed a coworker acting unusual recently, particularly someone who showed an interest in other employees' routines. The silence in the room became almost heavy, and a few people turned their eyes toward me, maybe because Darren had talked to me more than most. One of the officers approached and asked if I could step aside for a moment. He spoke quietly, explaining that the person seen near the break-in wore a dark jacket similar to what several people at the warehouse wore, so they were checking shifts and vehicle descriptions. When he asked if I lived near the complex, I nodded, and he raised an eyebrow, not accusing, just connecting dots. He asked if I'd told any coworkers about my address, and I said no, not in specific terms. He looked thoughtful for a second, then asked if I remembered anything strange from the night before. I hesitated, trying to choose my words carefully because everything felt surreal. Finally, I told him about Darren waiting by the back exit long after most of us had driven away, his focus on the parking lot, the unusual questions about where people lived. The officer wrote a few things down, thanked me, and then walked over to talk to the supervisor again. The rest of us gathered for the shift huddle, but nobody was paying attention to the usual safety reminders. Darren didn't show up for work that morning, which wasn't totally unheard of during seasonal chaos. People quit or got sick all the time. But considering everything that had just happened, his absence landed differently. Every time the door opened, people glanced up, expecting him to walk in late, grinning like nothing was going on. But he never came. And while everyone else was whispering theories, my mind kept circling the same thought. There was no way he should have known where I lived. I'd made sure of it. And yet someone with a build like his had been seen wandering my complex while I slept. By the time lunch rolled around, most of us were pretending to work while really just watching the entrance, waiting for the officers to come back with an update. They finally returned near the end of the shift and asked to speak with me again, this time in the manager's office. One of them explained that a neighbor at my complex had reported seeing the suspect walk directly toward the stairwell leading to my building. They had even mentioned something about the person pausing near my door, leaning in close as if listening. Hearing that made the whole room feel smaller. I kept thinking about how Darren had acted like he understood my vague directions, nodding like he was tracing an invisible map. The officers asked if I'd be willing to verify whether anything had been disturbed in my apartment once the shift ended, which I agreed to, even though the idea of walking back into that hallway made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. When I returned to the complex with the officers following behind me, everything looked deceptively normal. Snow had piled up along the walkway, untouched except for the maintenance guy's footprints. My door was locked, just like I'd left it, and nothing seemed moved inside. But the officers pointed out something I hadn't noticed. Faint marks on the frame where someone had tried to pry it open, shallow but distinct. I couldn't understand why anyone would target my unit specifically. My place wasn't valuable, and I'd given no one a reason to think otherwise. One officer checked the stairwell while another took a few photos. They asked again if any coworkers might hold a grudge or know where I lived. I kept thinking about Darren's quiet nods, his way of absorbing every answer people gave him. It didn't make sense, but at the same time it made too much sense to ignore. Over the next few days, work felt different. People were tense, watching each other in ways they hadn't before. Darren never came back. Not a call, not a text to the supervisor, nothing. His locker was still full of his stuff, including a notebook tucked behind a pair of gloves. Management handed it over to the police without opening it, but the rumor mill worked overtime. Some said it was full of maps and shift times. Others claimed it had addresses written in messy handwriting. Nobody knew for sure because the officers kept everything quiet. The only concrete thing we learned was that the break-in suspect matched Darren's height and gait almost exactly. That alone would have been unsettling, but knowing he'd singled me out with those questions made the whole situation sit wrong in my head. Weeks passed without any real updates, but the officers told me privately that whoever attempted the break-in hadn't been seen around the complex again. They suggested I change a few routines, stay aware, keep my lights on at night, and let them know if anything strange happened. I followed every piece of advice they gave. Darren was never arrested, never questioned. He had simply disappeared after that shift, leaving behind a trail of unease that none of us could shake. Eventually, the warehouse season ended, and everyone went their separate ways. But I still remember the quiet way he watched the parking lot that night, as if he were sorting people the same way we sorted boxes. I never found out what he wanted from me, or how far his plans went, but the break-in attempt stopped completely after he vanished. To this day, I don't know if that was supposed to be a warning or the end of something he hadn't finished. The overnight shifts at the hospital used to give me a strange sort of comfort, like the quiet was a break from the usual chaos of the day. I'd been working in radiology for a few years by then, long enough to know every weird hum from the old MRI suite and the exact pattern the fluorescent lights made when they flickered. That night started like any other, me eating a microwaved burrito too fast, scrolling through my phone between scans, and trying to stay awake as the place settled into that eerie stillness only hospitals get after midnight. My life at the time was pretty routine. Work, sleep, repeat. I wasn't chasing excitement, and I definitely wasn't looking for anything unsettling. But around 1 in the morning, as I walked down the south wing toward the imaging station, I saw someone standing near the end of the hallway. Someone I recognized instantly, but who had absolutely no reason to be there. His name was Marcus. We weren't close, but we ran into each other enough during regular daytime shifts to exchange the usual small talk. He worked on the orthopedic floor, 1 level below mine, and his schedule never overlapped with nights. The guy had this habit of leaning slightly to one side when he stood, like he was saving energy, or thinking about something far away. That part of him looked the same, but everything else felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain at first. He was only partly visible under the emergency lighting, one shoulder lit, the rest of him swallowed by the dim stretch of hallway behind him. He didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't even seem to breathe deeply. Just watched me as if he'd been standing there long before I turned the corner, waiting for me to notice. I called out to him, something casual like, "Dude, what are you doing up here?" expecting him to laugh or tell me someone screwed up his schedule. Instead, he tilted his head just a little as if the movement was delayed or he was mimicking something he'd seen humans do before but hadn't mastered. Then he repeated my exact words back at me, same tone, same pacing, just slower, like the sound had to travel through something thick before it reached me. It caught me so off guard that I actually stopped walking for a second, trying to make sense of it. I asked again if he was all right, and he repeated that too, a beat later, every syllable stretched thin. No emotion, no confusion, just this blank expression that never shifted, not even when I stepped closer to him. It felt less like someone responding and more like a recording lagging behind. I told him I'd call security if he didn't explain what was going on, and he finally turned away, disappearing into the stairwell without making a sound. I figured maybe he was having some sort of episode or messing with me, but something about the way he moved, smooth, almost too smooth, didn't line up with the guy I knew. I went back to my station trying to shake it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. But 15 minutes later, when I left the imaging room to grab a chart, he was there again. Different hallway this time, closer to my wing, standing half hidden behind a supply cart like he'd been placed there on purpose. Same posture, same stare, same complete stillness. And when I said his name, he didn't even blink. He just began to repeat it back to me, dragging out the sound as if testing the weight of it for the first time. The more the night dragged on, the harder it became to convince myself this was some strange misunderstanding. I even checked the staffing sheet at the nurse's station, scrolling through the roster twice just to be sure I wasn't mixing up names or dates. Marcus wasn't assigned anywhere in the building that night. The orthopedic floor was staffed with a completely different team, and nobody had swapped shifts. Still, every time I stepped into a new hallway, whether I was heading to the CT room or cutting through the short corridor by the elevators, he was already there. Sometimes he stood at the very end of the hall, barely visible under a dying light fixture. Other times he was positioned unnervingly close, so still that it felt unnatural. I tried calling out to him again, louder, but each time he only copied my words back at me, just a hair too late, like an echo with intention behind it. I thought about calling security again, but the truth is I hesitated. The hospital was short-staffed that night, and the last thing I wanted was to kick up a fuss if it turned out to be a harmless mix-up. I even texted one of the orthopedic nurses I knew, asking if Marcus was covering for someone or doing some kind of after-hours project. She replied almost immediately. He had clocked out earlier that afternoon. She'd literally watched him leave. That message made something tighten in my chest, this deep, spreading unease that wouldn't let go. I walked back into the radiology suite and locked the door behind me, something I'd never done in all my time working there. About 30 minutes later, I had to step out again to bring a patient down for a late-night ultrasound. I wasn't exactly thrilled about leaving the safety of my room, but I couldn't justify ignoring a scheduled scan. When I pushed the door open, the hallway outside looked empty at first glance. Too empty, actually, like someone had cleared out faster than they should have. The air felt heavy in that space, the kind of quiet that makes every sound ring louder than it should. I kept my head down and moved quickly toward the elevator, rehearsing what I'd say if I saw him again. But halfway there, I caught a glimpse of movement near the water fountain, just to my left. There he was, leaning slightly, features lost in the shallow pool of light. He didn't move, didn't adjust his stance, didn't acknowledge me at all. But the moment I muttered, "Why are you doing this?" he responded, my own voice thrown back at me, thinner this time, like the words were draining him somehow. I kept walking, pretending I didn't hear him, but I could sense, more than see, that he stayed fixed on me until I turned the corner. When I reached the elevator, I jabbed the call button over and over, wishing the damn doors would open faster. As I waited, I heard footsteps coming from the direction I'd just come, but they didn't sound right. They were too even, too perfectly spaced, like someone had practiced them. I refused to turn around until I absolutely had to, and when I finally glanced back, he had already reached the opposite end of the hall. Same posture, same unreadable expression, same silence. I stepped into the elevator the second the doors opened and practically slammed my palm on the button for the first floor, praying he wouldn't follow. When I reached the first floor, I forced myself to act normal for the patient's sake. She was an older woman from the cardiac unit, chatty in the way people get when they're nervous, and I did my best to respond like nothing strange was happening upstairs. But even while we rode the elevator back up together, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting beyond the doors. When they opened, the hallway was empty, and for a moment, I let myself breathe. I walked her to the ultrasound room, helped her get situated, and stepped out to grab a pair of gloves. The second I turned toward the supply cabinet, I saw him again, standing near the crash cart, his outline warped by the dim reflection off the metal. He didn't face me directly this time. Instead, his head was angled just enough that I could tell he knew exactly where I was. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, "What do you want?" And he whispered it back, dragging the question out so long it barely resembled speech anymore. My instinct was to get the patient out of there, but I couldn't risk alarming her or leaving her unattended. So I did the only thing that made sense. I went back into the room, closed the door quietly behind me, and stayed there until the scan was finished. When I returned her to her unit, every hallway felt like it was holding its breath. The lights flickered in patterns I'd never noticed before, almost like the building was reacting to something moving through it. On my way back to radiology, I took the long route, hoping distance would shake him loose, but deep down I already knew it didn't matter. Whatever was shadowing me wasn't following in the normal sense. It was just appearing, slipping into place as if it belonged to the hospital more than any of us did. By the time I reached my hallway again, I was exhausted from the constant tension. And there he was for the 100th time, positioned exactly where the corridor curved, standing perfectly still as though he'd been carved out of the darkness. The breaking point came around 4 in the morning. I'd barricaded myself inside the radiology suite with a rolling chair propped under the door handle. Not that it would have stopped him if he wanted to come in. I sat there listening, trying to tell the difference between the building settling and actual footsteps. At one point, something brushed the small glass window on the door, the kind of faint sound you'd expect from someone dragging their sleeve across it. I stayed absolutely quiet. Then I heard my own voice, but distorted, stretched thin, coming from the other side. "Let me in." It wasn't anger or pleading. It wasn't even directed at me in an emotional sense. It was more like something trying to copy a sound it didn't fully understand. I stayed seated and stared at the door until the voice faded, and eventually, everything went silent again. When the day shift started to roll in around 6, I practically bolted out of the room. Sunlight coming through the front windows felt unreal, like stepping into a different world entirely. I went straight to the orthopedic floor before heading home, partly to prove to myself that Marcus existed in the normal sense I remembered. I asked one of his coworkers if he'd shown up early, and she shook her head. Apparently he hadn't worked a night shift in years. Later that afternoon, after I'd finally slept a few hours, I called him directly, not to confront him, but just to hear if he sounded okay. He picked up sounding completely normal, confused as to why I was asking about the night shift. I didn't tell him the details. There's no way he would have believed me. But I did ask one last question before hanging up. "Were you anywhere near the hospital last night?" He said no without hesitation. And the thing that still messes with me is how certain I am that he was telling the truth.